Welcome to a special webinar on multiculturalism. Welcome on behalf of the Pearson Center. This is the 50th anniversary of the Multiculturalism Policy that was first brought in on October the 8th, 1971, and the first policy of its kind in the world. My name is Andrew Cardozo, and I'm president of the Pearson Center. I want to take a moment to recognize that the Pearson Center is headquartered on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. And I want to take a moment to let you know a little bit about the center. We're a leading think tank that addresses social and policy issues of the day. Since the start of COVID, we've had over 50 webinars and had about 10,000 people participate. So we're really glad to have you here today. All our past webinars are available on YouTube. We're proud to say that we're one of the only think tanks, perhaps the only one, which traditionally includes in the work we do representatives of all 5 political parties represented in the House of Commons, top business, labor leaders, and social and civil society leaders and other experts. As we like to say, we bring people and ideas together. A special thank you to all our donors and our sponsors, especially our sustaining sponsors, including Canada's Building Trades Unions, the International Association of Firefighters, and the MAPCO, Ontario's professional employees. While these webinars are free to attend, please feel free to visit our website, thepearsoncentre.ca, to make a contribution. So today our webinar is about multiculturalism at 50. Where have we come and where do we need to go? We want to talk about federal policy as well as society at large. We have 3 influential and seasoned practitioners to talk to us about these issues. The Honorable Dr. Hetty Fry, who has just been re-elected for the 10th time in Vancouver Centre. She's a former Minister of Multiculturalism and the Status of Women, first elected in 1993. I want to tell you that she occupies a special place in Canadian history as the longest serving woman member of Parliament and person of color in the House of Commons. Welcome back to the Pearson podium, Eddie.
Thank you, Andrew.
Dr. Karen Mock is a human rights specialist, former chair of the Canadian Multiculturalism Advisory Council and former executive director of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. She is volunteer president of JSpace Canada, a progressive Jewish organization. I'm happy to say she's a founding member of the Pearson Center and a driver in these issues on our board. Andrew Griffith is a researcher and blogger, former Director General of Citizenship and Multiculturalism with the Government of Canada. One of the things he's written is a book entitled Multiculturalism in Canada, Evidence and Anecdotes, which provides an integrated view of how well multiculturalism is working. Just briefly on the format, following a discussion for about 45 minutes, we will go to you, the audience, for your questions. So please send us your questions on the question box that's on your screen, and we'll get to questions in about 45 minutes. So with that, let me start the discussion. I'm going to start with you, Karen Mock, and ask you, the policy was brought in on October the 8th, 1971. So in 5 minutes, can you tell us what happened in the last 50 years?
1 minute a decade, and I'm a storyteller, so I'm going to try to talk very quickly. I must tell you, on October 8th, 1971, when Pierre Elliott Trudeau announced on the floor of the House that we would have a policy of multiculturalism, it came as a wonderful statement for so many of us. I can't go into the whole history and how the Bilingual and Bicultural Commission that was only supposed to be 3 volumes ended up with 4 volumes because there were so many others that wanted to have a voice. I'm going to put in a plug for the Pearson Center's website, where a few years ago I got asked in honor of the anniversary to post a major paper that I had done on revitalizing multiculturalism, and it was, where have we been? Where are we now? Where are we going? So for those people who really want a more in-depth overview of the roots of it, where we are now, and some of the challenge we faced over the years, check it out on the Pearson website. Having said that, I personally was very involved in education initially. I was in teacher education, and I'm old enough that they call me a pioneer, having created the very first course in multicultural anti-racist teacher education in Canada that was mandatory when I was teaching at Ryerson. And I taught also at the U of T in postgraduate teacher education, bringing in the importance, even though I'm a psychologist and was teaching child development and educational psychology, of the importance of putting theory into practice of cognitive development. Well, in multiculturalism, it was exactly the same thing. How do you put theory and policy into practice? Educators welcomed the policy, and it had very much an education focus as well. Yes, it was called Celebrating Our Differences was the campaign, and some people called it a song and dance approach, or as one of my colleagues in the anti-racism world calls it, the Saris and Samosas approach. Again, having said that, still what the federal level was able to do through its programs was fund local and provincial and even educational initiatives, so that this ethos of how do we ensure that all Canadians are treated equally and fairly, and that their own cultural backgrounds are recognized. It was very much multiculturalism within the bilingual framework. 10 years into it, we had the very first conference of the CCMIE, the Canadian Council of Multicultural and Intercultural Education, funded by the educational division of the multicultural unit at the time. And the idea was to network, to get people to speak to each other across the country. The big meeting in 1981 was in Winnipeg, actually. And that was where people like Art Miki, who was working to lobby for redress for the Japanese internment, and where Indigenous people gathered, and where people literally gathered from coast to coast. Why? Because every province had its multicultural association with an education focus, with a cultural focus, and it went literally across the country. What happened in 81? Many of us found a voice there, including Indigenous people, including people of color, that there needed also to be a stronger focus on anti-racism, because embedded in the policy was the notion of equality and full achievement of all Canadians. But we needed to name it. We couldn't use the R word in those days and get funded. You couldn't speak about anti-racism, but it slowly but surely, the policy began to be strengthened because the language was there. We had the leverage of the language of equality and justice for all. We said CCMIE in those days because it was multiculturalism and interculturalism. That was to satisfy the bilingual framework. And sections were included in these conferences so that all the voices were heard. The lobbying continued, and by 1988, the lobbying amongst many of us was strong enough. It actually was enshrined in law with the Multiculturalism Act. And we need to, and that, of course, was the notion of now with stronger staff, an act in legislation, the language was there. It was, of course, building on what was now by 82 was the charter and the equality provisions in the charter, and Canada was on the map. We were being looked to as a country that understood how it was so important, not just to pay tokenism to immigrants, but to integrate and to give equality under the law and ensure that we also handled the anti-racism. However, I must say, and by this time, by the way, by 1989, I had gone full-time into human rights, not just in education anymore, but became the head of the League for Human Rights of Neighbour Canada. And that's, I think, where Hedy Fry and I first started to got to know each other, because I became much more of a lobbyist, and to show how in those days it was not a political football. Jerry Weiner, Minister of State for Multiculturalism, or Secretary of State, because it became Minister of State afterwards, in 1990, conservative, appointed me to chair the Canadian Multicultural Advisory Committee. He said he wanted people with real expertise. Previously, it was kind of political folks who had been on this advisory committee, and he invited to be on this committee people from all political stripes, but people from the different jurisdictions, police, health, you name it, education, political advocacy groups, and the co-chairs. I was asked to chair it, but we had Pierre Antille, Pour l'Un Québécois as a co-chair, Val Romilly, originally from Trinidad and from BC, the other side of the country, Corinne Jeté, Aboriginal woman, and we were all together. We didn't know about things like caucuses at the time. Our caucuses, when we had meetings, they were not on ethnic or racialized lines. They were on health and policing, and the idea was working together. Let me just quickly say what happened there, not just there, but where our biggest challenges were. And then I'm going to stop, because I'm not going to be able to tell you where we are now. I'm going to turn it over to Hedy for that, but it forebodes what was happening. And in 1991, I wrote in a topic called Multicultural and Canadian Identity, One and the Same. There is no question that the Federal Multiculturalism Act is among the most forward-looking and insightful pieces of legislation of its kind in the world. The concept of multiculturalism, which the Act embodies, is one which makes real our commitment to equality for all and an end to racism, and establishes this as an attainable goal if we all do our share. And then it went on in sort of a positive way. But I said, why does it have so many detractors then? I mean, the research of the day, the good news was that 66 or 70% of the population was saying multiculturalism and immigration and all those things were a positive sense of identity. And in Canadian culture, yes, there were the 15% who were against it, but they could be marginalized, and the majority of Canadians valued it. But I said that the detractors against multiculturalism were of two types. They fell into two broad groups. First, there were those who could be called, at the end of the day, patriotic racists. These are the people who, ostensibly out of their love for Canada and their desire for harmony among its citizens, have included that the more we're alike, the better we are, or at least the better we can describe what we are. And essentially, in times of trouble, in economic downturn, or dare I say, in time of plague or pandemics or what have you, in times of difficulty, who gets blamed? By that group. It's the immigrants, it's the minority groups. And again, the language is evolving. We don't say minority groups, it's racialized groups, it's religious groups. Who are being targeted today. Now it's Muslims, Jews, people of color, and so on still. And the divisiveness is there. So many average Canadians are drawn in by the rhetoric of that kind of blame during economic times. And we shouldn't forget that our democratic process, and in other countries, the democratic process can be undermined such that those white supremacist Nazi type voices can rule the day. But the second group that worried me even more, and I'm wrapping up right now, included many members of racialized and minority groups. Many people ordinarily very clear thinking who claim that multiculturalism involves frivolous government spending and isn't doing enough to counter the difficult issues. And so they end up even today, many people, where it is the legislation that embodies the agencies and the funding for anti-racism work and so on, and supports the legislation supports it, to end up with the divisiveness within and between multicultural or racialized groups on these issues means that they become very strange bedfellows, which people who think that it shouldn't be a part of Canadian identity. Can we do better? Yes, we can. And we'll talk about that maybe when we deal with questions and answers. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Karen.
Oh, I do have to say before Hetty comes on, again, I cannot tell you how honored I was when the Honorable Hetty Fry in 2001, after we struggled for many, many years on these issues, actually appointed me to chair the Civil Society Advisory Committee for the preparation for Durban. And then eventually, I guess that was in about 97 or 98 that happened. And then I was honored to have been appointed by her and the next government as the head of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. And the rest, as they say, is history.
Okay, so now thank you, Karen. And let's move to some history. Dr. Fry, you were a Minister of the Crown, Minister of Multiculturalism. Tell us about the role you played as minister, both within your department and with the government at large.
Well, thank you. And I just want to say what an honor it is to be on a panel with Karen Mark. I mean, Karen inspired me when I first became the minister to understand what it is we were trying to do, what multiculturalism really meant. And so I have to say that she kind of was, in many ways, without knowing it, my mentor and a person who kind of guided me along the way in terms of my understanding of the issue. When I was actually, my whole portfolio was informed by the Multiculturalism Act itself, by the legislation. It was informed by the vision of multiculturalism that came out of that bilingual and bicultural commission that Elliott Trudeau had set up, when it is my understanding of the time that the Ukrainian community stood up on its, waved its arms and says, hey, there are some of us in this country who are neither of French or English backgrounds, and we have been building this nation. So we want to talk about the multicultural nature of this country. It's not simply a bicultural nature. Trudeau listened, and then the rest, again, is what happened. But I must say that at the time, Carol said that there wasn't a great deal of partisanship in terms of political partisanship, because Trudeau brought in the multiculturalism policy. It was strengthened by the Multiculturalism Act under a progressive conservative government of Brian Mulroney at the time. We were all on the same page because, as Karen said, internationally, the world was looking to Canada as a beacon. We were doing some things that the world had not seen happen before. The world has been and still is defined by ethnic conflict, racial conflict, tribal conflict, and we were trying to show that it was possible for people, regardless of their ethnicity, and this is the actual language of the Act, their ethnicity, their race, their color, their language, their religion, and their Aboriginal status, that in fact, regardless of that, we could form a nation of people who mutually respected each other, who could live together in peaceful coexistence, building a nation. And I think that was the vision of it. And I think that still should be the vision of what Canada is. I remember while I was minister, there was a paper written and brought in from the United Kingdom, actually saying, my goodness, multiculturalism was a worthwhile thing to do. But I must say that when I came in, being informed by the Act was specific. So I knew clearly what I had to do. One, we had to be informed by the statistics. In other words, statistics that tell us what our ethnicity, our race, our color. At that time, the word was not just color, the word was visible minority. In other words, if you look different, were you treated differently? And then, of course, ethnicity was a big part. language, because within the act was actually within and under the umbrella of bilingualism, under the umbrella of looking at language as well as an issue. And so, you know, it was meant to get the data and then do research and get groups to do research, universities, etc., to see how people who were fitting into these different categories were in fact participating fully in the economic, social, political, and cultural life of the country. Were they making it? Were they getting there? Was that justice for all, opportunity for all happening? And if it wasn't, why not? What are the challenges? And out of that came policy that then tried to address the challenges and programs that helped communities that were falling behind to be able to actually overcome the barriers that they faced. So it was mostly about giving people the skills and the tools that they needed through policies and programs to be able to overcome challenges. But the first part of multiculturalism, I like to say, was about getting to know you. That was the, you know, song and dance and food and ethnicity and stuff. People began to feel comfortable with each other's differences. The second part, of course, was now not only getting to know you, but actually getting to live with you, getting to find out that you were not scary, that it was okay to live next door to you. It was okay for your kids to go to school with you. And then came the other part that basically said, the third part, which is what my mandate I felt was, and what I tried to preside over and make happen, was respect. Not only do I tolerate you, not only do I think it's okay that I'm not scared of you, but it's okay for me to understand that you bring something fundamental to this country, that the benefits you bring, your language, your culture, your understanding of the world and the parts of the world that you come from, makes us a global nation, a nation in which we understand each other, we're learning to live with each other. I remember, actually, I can't remember what the year was, but the Globe and Mail did a massive piece on what had happened as a result of multiculturalism, and they were talking about things like intermarriage. People were intermarrying between religions that hated each other were marrying each other. The children who have different colors were marrying each other, and what that generation of the day was doing is that they were looking at how bringing in, let us say, getting your child to learn to speak more than one language or more than two languages was important for that child in the globalization was happening, coming down would be important. The Canada would be a leader in that. Also, that if a child could understand 3 different religions within that intermarriage, then that child was going to grow up to be a child who learned to respect others. At the end of the day, for me, what multiculturalism was all about was showing the world that diverse people who in other parts of the world, their home countries, were killing each other, hating each other, doing all kinds of things to each other, could come here and go to school together, could get married, could build policy together, could build a nation together. It was about that. It was showing the world that it is possible for people to put aside the hate and the conflict and actually move forward to build something strong, which is, of course, nation building, and to define who Canadians were, people who were learning from each other all the time and getting to become a global nation. And for me, that was the big thing about me. But the important things I had to make sure was that we had the statistics telling us what, in fact, were the different new people were coming to Canada all the time. So the statistics were changing. And so Statistics Canada played a huge role in defining the communities. The research piece of it, which was required, told us how those communities were faring. Were they being discriminated against? Were they having opportunity, etc.? The third piece of it, of course, was to then try and find out how we can overcome the barriers so that all of the groups that we talked about that made up Canada was able to participate fully in the economic, social, cultural, social, cultural, economic, and other parts of Canadian life, political parts. And so one of the things I focused on too is, who did we have in the House of Commons? Did we have people who were different in the House of Commons? Why weren't they joining? Why weren't they joining the armed forces? Why weren't they joining institutions? Why weren't they represented in the public service? And what were those barriers? And we had started moving forward actually with the bureaucracy of the time I was minister to look at how we got people to join the armed forces, the institutions, to join the RCMP, to be able to be part of the federal public service. And we had clear programs set out to do exactly that. And so today, or even then, when you started years ago to see people with turbans in the armed forces, that was because we had made that institutional change so that people could feel at home. And it wasn't just about people changing to fit the institution, but the institution changing to welcome all Canadians into their ranks. And that was how Canada was going to move forward. Unfortunately, one of the big problems, and it was an all-of-government approach. I mean, I had to take that research and that data and all of the challenges, present it to Cabinet, and let Cabinet look at all of the areas within finance, within the social structures, within everything. In fact, how was it playing? Was it working? Was it not working, etc.? So they could all play their role. It wasn't just for the Minister of Multiculturalism to do it. It was for everybody to move towards creating this kind of nation that we had all envisioned. I think that was very important. And of course, the advisory council that Karen headed up for a while was very important, because that was civil society coming together. I recall, as Karen said, when we went to Durban, we had 100 people representing 100, the Black Congress of Canada, the Canadian Jewish Congress, the Muslim Federation. You know, we had everybody, Hispanic Congress, everybody was there represented, coming together as a whole, making, I mean, at the time in Durban, people were shocked to see different people, including the Indigenous peoples there as part of this group that represented Canada. And we played a major role, in fact, you may not say it's a major role, but we walked out on the second meeting of the non-governmental organizations meetings of the United Nations in Durban, mainly because the Canadians walked out. The Canadians said, this is not what we came here for. We didn't come here to spew hate and difference and division. We came here to talk about how we build something new and different. And they just walked out and they refused to participate. So, you know, there are a whole lot of things that this fell apart when, and I'm not being partisan here, I'm just giving you historic fact. When Stephen Harper became government, what he did was he stopped Statistics Canada from existing. So bang, all the data gathering from the Multiculturalism Act was no longer served. Secondly, he abandoned multiculturalism and what it was meant to do, and started looking at it back in the old days when it was getting to know you. Let's go and give people money to have a celebration and let everybody sing and dance, and that's going to be multiculturalism in action. And so a lot of those important segments that we were looking at changing fell by the wayside. And when that happens over 10 years, institutions begin to fall into decay. They go back into their old ways of being. And what we see now is what we're talking about here, which is institutional change. I just want to use one word that is very important to me, Andrew. And that, how much time do I have left?
About 30 seconds.
Okay, I just want to say one important thing. I've forgotten what it was now. I was going to say something really important about what we need to remember is ethnicity is a big piece of that language, and language is a big piece of it. So it's all the languages that are spoken in this country. We need to foster it and engage it and move forward. And if we get questions later on, I will talk about what that did in terms of Canada's trade with the world. How multiculturalism played a major role, because people had been living here for 25 and 30 years from countries, and they still knew the marketplace, and they still knew the ability to speak the language, and they were able as Canadians to go out there and engage other communities in trading with us. That's a big part of our economic contribution. So I think there are so many things to say, and now we are back to looking at where we try and build 12, 13 years later, after the whole thing fell apart, into looking. But I don't want us to lose sight of ethnicity. I think many times what we do is we focus on visible minority groups, but we do not focus on ethnicity and religion as much as we used to.
Okay.
Because ethnicity is a big, big challenge.
Okay, we'll come back to some of that, I think. Andrew Griffith, I just want to get from you a sense of the work the program does, both within the department and across the government.
Well, first of all, it's an honor to be on a panel like this and sort of people who are the pioneers and are still active in the field. It's sort of like, I feel like a Johnny-come-lately in many ways. And my time in the program was really during the Harper years. And it wasn't all darkness. There were some innovations there that I think were worthwhile reflecting upon. But the program really has those two elements. Like the one element is really what is actually quite a small program in government terms, not much money, not many people, but the ethos of multiculturalism and how it spreads across the department, how it's reflected in other acts like employment equity, Canadian Human Rights Act and things like that. That's really the broader impact of multiculturalism. It's how it plays in that space, how that ethos has actually percolated across the departments. I mean, not perfectly, some departments are better than others and the like, but the fact that we have an annual report on multiculturalism requires bureaucrats and other departments to say, well, actually ask, what are we doing here? Do we have some things using sort of the bureaucratic levers of what I call pride, if you've got something to share, and shame, if you've got something to hide, as a way to sort of move things forward. It's a weak instrument, but it's something that works. But the thing that always surprises me is when you look at it from an institutional bureaucratic point of view, for such a small program, it's had an incredible impact in terms of how Canadians think about the country, think about others, are able to have some conversation, sometimes easier, sometimes not so easy, develop concepts like reasonable accommodation in terms of how do you actually deal with sort of a common system of law and where do you have to provide flexibility, accommodation. And of course that applies not just with respect to visible minorities, but Indigenous and other minorities. And the other thing that sort of strikes me interesting in the program, and I think Dr. Fry, you were alluding to that, is, and Karen as well, is that when I look back at the Act and the policy, the one thing that it didn't really address explicitly was the question of religious diversity. It's there, it's implied in the principles, and I would argue probably that the general principles can be applied pretty well horizontally across. I think the policy was well written, the Act was well written, and they're horizontal. But what we've seen over time is that essentially most of the issues, accommodation issues and other issues, tend to revolve more around religious diversity, not exclusively, but more around religious diversity. That's where the court cases end up. What is accommodation? And I think that's one thing that will continue over time, just reflecting the diversity of the country. The one thing I would highlight in terms of the Harper years that I thought was useful is that there's a historic reason and an ongoing reason for separating out the mainstream Canadians like me and the visible minorities and religious minorities of others. But the issues of bias, discrimination, prejudice also exist between communities and within communities. Like no group is monolithic. You have the whole dimension of intersectionality and the like. And so that was the one, in my view, one of the more positive elements that they brought to consideration of the policy, because for so long, for understandable reasons, we've been focused on the white, brown, black dynamic. So I'll leave it there because I know that the time is running out and I want to make sure there's enough time for questions, but I'll leave it like that.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, we do want to go to questions in about 10 minutes. I have a few other short questions. Karen, you've been doing a lot of work in anti-racism. You're head of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. Can I just ask you for your definition of systemic racism? There's a lot of controversy around this, especially in Quebec these days. What is systemic racism?
Whew, would have got my official definition out, you know, from the hate crimes community working group and all of the other definitions that evolve. Systemic racism occurs when the outcome shows a differentiation among groups on racialized lines. I mean, we used to say that it can be intentional, you know, where a law, for example, or a policy would actually discriminate against people. I mean, you know, they used to have height and weight restrictions for police officers or firefighters. And when you looked at, you know, women, you know, gender issues, or even members of different groups, different minority groups, you could see that there was a correlation. So they changed that systemic barrier to equality because what was happening is systematically many Asian people and women and others were eliminated from the workforce. So they made the requirement not height and weight, but how much can you carry, or, you know, that kind of thing. So it was more work related. Systemic discrimination on religious grounds occurs when there's a policy that says you're not allowed to wear a head covering. That has nothing whatsoever to do with your work. Systemic discrimination occurs when people of color are evaluated more harshly in the system or overrepresented vis-a-vis their percentage of the population in the criminal justice system. And then we look back to the economic aspects and the employment aspects. So we look at not people's intentions, we look at the actual outcomes of a policy, and that's where our data are so important. And so any government, I don't care which government it is, that removes the funding, you know, for doing really effective research, or refuses to disaggregate the data. And by the way, that's what I mean by putting theory and policy into practice, because if we don't actually practice what we preach, then we don't have a hope of having equality. And it doesn't, or equity rather, it doesn't mean treating everybody the same. But if there's systemic discrimination, we may have to do different things to level the playing field. I know these sound like cliches, but they're not. And so we need to listen when people talk about Black Lives Matter or Every Child Matters, at the same time as making sure that even any of these movements or single issue organizations or people are not inadvertently or maybe deliberately discriminating against others. So it's constantly being vigilant on all forms of discrimination, not just, I mean, if we use the term racist or systemic racism, and somebody thinks we're accusing them of wearing their bed sheets out at night and burning crosses, then we are not communicating effectively what systemic racism actually is. And by the way, I do want to add, same on the concept of multiculturalism. We need to do more effective marketing so people truly understand what systemic discrimination is. I remember this document that we did in the early 90s. Why? Because all the negative voices were so much more powerful and had got so much more press. Anybody wanted to get famous, all they had to do was badmouth multiculturalism and they'd end up on the front page, no matter who they were. They write a book about it and then they would sell. So we had to counter that, and I'm hoping that the current government will help people through their anti-racism directorate and through the multiculturalism department. It should not have been used as a political football. And one day it's a ministry and the next day it's not. And then now it's in Canadian Heritage and then it's in Ministry of Citizenship. and so on. As Hetty said, it needs to, that understanding of what it really means and why the anti-racism and anti-systemic discrimination piece is so crucial to it has to be effectively communicated across all levels.
Thanks. Okay. I just want to remind you, the audience, will be taking questions from you shortly. So please do go to your question box and send us any questions you have. Hetty Fry, I want to ask you, as an MP over the years, especially now, what are the kinds of issues you find that people bring to you? Where are the greatest needs in terms of overcoming racism and creating equality? What are the issues that you deal with and your colleagues speak to?
Well, again, I think it's all about getting that data gathering. I think we tend to use the word racism, I think, quite loosely, because I think, you know, while, as Karen said, we need to listen to the groups that are at the bottom of the barrel right now, who have lack of access to anything, and for whom institutions actually create a shutout mechanism. We need to remember that it's not only your race that matters, your ethnicity matters. And this is something I learned when I became minister. There are a lot of people who even today come to my office as an MP and say to me, you know, I can't find work because my name is Mohammed, or I can't find work because my name is Kowalski. Even though I look like everybody else, I'm not distinguished as a visible minority. My color of my skin is white, because we now know that Africa is made up of white, brown, black, yellow, whole lots of different colors. But people suddenly find they have an accent. And that accent suddenly makes them not get a job because people can't understand them. And they say, oh no, oh no, oh no. So you find a lot of people want to change their names to something that is not representative of their ethnicity. And yet ethnicity is a huge place where there are barriers as well as race. And I think that's where, as you just said, Karen, that the whole idea of, and you mentioned it, and Andrew, that the idea of a religion has never been looked at specifically. At the time when I was first involved in multiculturalism, religion was anti-Semitic. That was the only form of discrimination we knew, anti-Semitism. After 9/11, suddenly we saw Islamophobia raising its head. And those are the two we talk about. But I think the concept within the idea of multiculturalism is that you should be able to worship who you wish to worship, or if you don't wish to worship. But, you know, you should be able to, that should not prevent you from having access. And the stereotyping that comes with building ideas about people because of how they look, because of how they speak, because of their name, because of their religion, is what we are striving to get rid of in multiculturalism. That you know, what was it that Martin Luther King, who was all about race, it was about Black lives under Martin Luther King, and yet he said that he had a dream that he wanted to see a day when people will be judged by the character and not by the color of their skin. And we want to add, as Canadians, not by their name or by their ethnicity or by the religion or by the God they serve or do not serve. That in fact, we judge them by their character and what they can bring to this idea of building this great nation that we know Canada has the potential to become. And so I think for me, this is what I'm hearing all the time. I still see discrimination systemically, systemic discrimination on people who may look white, but who still are discriminated against because of wherever they came from, etc. And I think this is something that we need to be careful about. As Karen said, if we have good data, it will point those things out to us. If that data is based on asking all of those pieces, and I go back to the Act, ethnicity, language, race, color, religion, indigenous status. What I learned when I was both Minister for Status of Women and Multiculturalism was that the two of them fed each other. I learned about intersectionality when I looked at gender. All of a sudden, gender was about the double barriers that you face because of your race, your ethnicity, your religion, your color, your indigenous status, etc., your disability, your sexual orientation. And all of a sudden, all of these things mattered. And to get data about how people with differences in this country are faring, how they are able to participate fully in Canadian economic, social, political, and cultural life is at the end of the day what we're trying to get to happen. That answers the question of justice for all, opportunity for all. And for me, that is something that we need to keep fighting for. And especially at difficult times when, as Karen says, when we're facing crises and everyone needs to turn outwardly and point at the other and say, it's all because of you that this is happening. So we haven't achieved what we want to achieve yet.
Yeah, thank you. And Andrew Griffith, can I just ask you to comment on, Eddie Fry talked about statistics. Can you give us a sense of how diverse the public service is and how there's the term used in employment equity laws, visible minorities, how the employment of visible minorities and Indigenous people is doing in the federal public service?
Okay, well, in general terms, when I look at the sort of data, I can split it any number of ways, but representation overall of visible minorities is slightly less than the percentage of visible minorities who are also Canadian citizens. It's obviously a greater difference with those who are just simply permanent residents and citizens. So there's that difference. Executives is quite a bit lower. I think it's about 11% of the last employment equity, and the number of visible minority citizens is around 17%. So there's a bigger gap there. For Indigenous, the macro numbers are reasonably close to the size of the population, but we now are getting better data, and this gets back to Dr. Fry's point, that we actually have disaggregated data by the individual visible minority groups, by occupational group, and the same for Indigenous groups. And so there we're sort of seeing the concentration of some groups more in the support positions, some more in the professional positions and the like. The one thing that's changed over the past year is that there used to be a preference for Canadian citizens in hiring and promoting in the public service. That was just changed the past year. So now that is no longer a factor that will affect the government's calculation of who is actually available for employment. So it's by no means in line with the overall population number. You know, the higher up the food chain you go, the lower the diversity. But it's still actually, I think, quite credible. And the other thing that I always look at is what is the progress over time. And year after year, whatever the government, you can see the numbers improving because that's the population of Canada. Where are you going to hire people? You have to hire the people there. Most visible minorities go to university at a higher level than, you know, native-born Canadians or, you know, the main stock or whatever it was, old stock Canadians, that famous phrase. Yeah, I'm using it in quotes for don't hit me for that. Yeah. You know, so I think you know, when I look at sort of what has happened over the last, well, since the Employment Equity Act, quite frankly, and how that decision to actually allow people to self-identify and again provide what I call the two mechanisms of pride and shame, that departments want to look good in front of the colleagues, in front of the clerk, and they don't want to be, you know, look bad like most of the security agencies look bad, quite frankly, in the numbers. They're not, you know, despite all the efforts that have been made over the year, their numbers are much worse than elsewhere. Anyway, better leave it there.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much. I want to read one of the other questions that's just come in. And I'll ask this of you, Karen. Are we effectively teaching human rights multicultural principles at all levels in schools across Canada? The questioner says he appreciates the matter of jurisdiction, but the hate I see in 2021 on Twitter and Facebook is terrible. Has social media changed the playing field, and is it now heightening and promoting racism? So two questions. One is the education system, and the other is social media.
The answer to the first question, is it being effectively taught? One word, no. It's very inconsistent. And the answer to the second question, has social media changed the playing field? Yes. It is outrageous that, I mean, again, this is the challenge of putting theory and policy into practice, both educational theory, theories of pedagogy, child development, everything else, would automatically require that human rights and anti-racist education and education on multiculturalism from the earliest childhood level right through to post-secondary, and the climate that we create has to be pervasive. But again, that's also often used as a political football in different jurisdictions. And you end up with, you get the kind of principal who knows how to, in a high school, who knows how to handle issues. We look at teacher education today, and because it's dominated in many cases by people who have one political agenda or another, or you know, we can talk about the far right or the far left kind of thinking that marginalizes some people and not others. And even the teachers in some jurisdictions are being well prepared to be able to handle sensitive issues in the classroom, especially because you've got people from so many different religious, ethnic, racialized, and other backgrounds, and not, you know, different national identities coming and bringing certain wars and traumas with them, and inherited community trauma. Where is the proper education so that they know how to handle it for all children and all students? So we must do much better there. And on the media, I'm glad to see that the government now is taking stronger action on hate on the internet. At least in the old days that Andrew was referring to, you know, people could stand on a street corner and hand out a pamphlet. But now, with just the flick of a button, you know, I used to be able to advise people, and I could tell them which was just two people and a fax machine in their basement claiming to be the Canadian Association of blah, 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 you know. But now, from the safety of their own modem, they can just spew this hate and TikTok and all the rest. And that's what the kids are into. They're seeing a soundbite about Muslims. They're seeing a soundbite about Jews. They're seeing a soundbite about Black people. And they do not have the knowledge to be able to counter it. And we have to do much better in that regard.
Hetty Fry, you wanted to jump in on this?
I wanted to say, pertinent to the question itself, when I was minister, I had started to work with the principals, the school principals of Canada's association, can't remember what it's called now. And we were knowing that because as a federal government, we did not have any jurisdiction at all over K-12. And, you know, we didn't have much jurisdiction over post-secondary either, but at least we had no jurisdiction. So what I was working with them on, when we were unable to continue it because we lost government and things changed. But what we were working on is CD-ROMs. This was a brand new idea, CD-ROM, right? It's technology at its greatest. And we were going to use CD-ROMs to tell stories, which I had already spent time with a film company doing stories called The Scattering of Seeds, which was small 30-minute vignettes which talked about the peoples that came to Canada, how they came and what they have contributed since then. And so it was of gaining respect for the people around them and seeing the Sikh kid sitting next to you in class not having known that they fought in Vimy, or looking at the Chinese and not understanding what they brought to the country in terms of building the railroad, and getting to learn respect. That was a big piece we were going to do. It never quite got to happen, and it's never been brought back since. But it's really important, this K-12, that we can get involved with the school principals, create CD-ROMs, show them in the classrooms, let them have work around them, etc., etc. And just one final thing that I wanted to say about that is that if we don't help children from that early age to understand that, in fact, a family that may be, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant that just came into Canada 6 years ago and the kids are in school, that the Chinese kid sitting next to them in British Columbia classroom has been here for about almost 130 years building this nation. So people tend to stop judging and stereotyping based on what they see, but really on what they learn and they know to be true.
Okay, we have a few questions. So I want to go a little faster, but just a quick comment from you, Andrew, if you've got anything to add in terms of social media and hate.
It's really hard. I mean, just what you see out there and how you counteract and everything like that. And I don't think there are any simple solutions, but it's very clear that there are some serious problems there. And I think the point that Karen was making in terms of the enabling effect of social media is one of the main things that, because in the past, negative attitudes were out there. There's no question, a certain percentage of the population, but it wasn't as visible as it is now, and it didn't have as much impact. It wasn't as diffused as it is now.
Karen, I have a question that I think you can answer well. How does critical race theory in education fit with multiculturalism? And maybe you can just remind us what critical race theory is.
Well, I'm not a scholar on it.
Asking you for all the definitions, but
I do know that in days gone by, people that were emerging the critical race theory and people who were working in anti-racism and in anti-racist education or human rights education worked very closely together. Sadly, I find that now, again, it's all about sound bites. If somebody doesn't like something that they heard somebody who's a critical race scholar say, then they turn around and they badmouth it and get all those sound bites out there, but they may actually even be misrepresenting it. You know, so right now, today, I know COVID, you know, the last year and a half has been problematic and people, but it's also these next generations. I don't like to be sounding like, you know, such an old timer, but people are not willing to sit down and have the conversations and again, putting their theories and policies into practice. There's a huge difference between dialogue and respectful academic discourse and analysis.
Mm-hmm.
There's a huge difference between that and debates and who can scream the loudest gets their way and who can get the most sound bites out and who can rally the troops and make it look like there's more votes or there's more this. And where are the people who are, and you know what, this requires time and time is money. So there does need to be funding for that. We don't have the opportunity anymore the way we did when ministers like Hetty Fry and Jerry Weiner and others were bringing people together across the country to share intelligence, whether it's intelligence on hate crime, but to share intelligence on practical strategies, on best practices. I'm looking to people like Peter Flagel in the Anti-Racism Directorate. I'm looking to people who say that yes, and to, you know, there's so many different departments and people not taking the time to not only know the history and the evolution and what these policies really say, but how do you actually implement them? And when I think of one of the things that NGOs really find frustrating is everything old is new again.
yeah,
The NGOs, the volunteers give their guts and their time and their energy. And then when there's a new wave, oh, now we need another consultation. When there are so many amazing reports and best practices, yes, they need a little tweaking and a little updating, but no, not starting from square one because there's been this huge gap. And now they say, oh, who cares that organization over there has a huge binder with everything you need to know about treaties and making sure that treaties are taught in the classroom. Oh no, we're going to start over. We're going to have a consultation. No, there's been a huge amount of amazing work. And I implore people who are in decision-making positions now to bring back that so that the critical race theorists who are practitioners and are teaching teachers all of this stuff, and those who are in the classroom, and those who are from Muslim, Jewish, Black, Hindu, Chinese, Asian, get together, not pitting groups against one another.
Okay, thank you. We're out of time, but Dr. Fry, I do have one question I want to ask you, which has come in, which is what advice and lessons do you have to share with young people of color about getting into politics?
Gosh.
In a minute or less.
I don't know what advice I have. The advice is, if you feel you have something really important to offer, you think you're capable, go in there, push the door open. I've done it all my life. I never saw myself as being somebody who was different and a person of color or anything. I saw a door and something was going on in there. I pushed the door open and I went like, "Hi guys," and I joined the conversation. Get involved, but in a positive way. And I think that that's the only thing I could say. Get involved in a political party, get involved in an NGO, get involved in a school, get involved, listen and learn. And I think Karen made an important point that I want to underscore here. And that is, if we keep reinventing a wheel, it is as if the problem is a brand new one that never occurred before, when there has been a lot of good work, and we should be building on the past. We should be building on what we learned and what worked, and not only just creating brand new things. We waste a lot of time creating brand new ideas. I mean, we had a huge action plan, Karen can tell you, about looking at how we move forward on multiculturalism. I don't know where it is, but it's out there somewhere, and we should begin to look at it and try moving forward. And finally, I just wanted to say, social media is not necessarily a bad thing, but what it has done, it has amplified the voices of minority groups to the extent that everyone thinks that they are making a big noise when there may only be 3 little marbles rattling around in that tin cup. And so we don't understand, as Karen says, what really is going on, because we can't research these people because they're anonymous and they're hidden, and what they do is they amplify their voices. And nobody is bothering to look at the past and to look at the analysis of what went on and what worked and didn't work. Everyone is ready to do the soundbite, to do the quick decision making. If you want to become a person of color and you want to get involved, decide what you want to do. Join, be a joiner, join something, get inside, start becoming part of the solution. Because if all you do is stand on the outside and become part of the pointing out the problem, there will never be a solution. Nothing will change. It'll feel good to be spewing things, but get in there, be positive, make change, listen to others, learn from others.
And let's do a webinar on that. Let's do another webinar on that very specific thing. How do we increase representation of racialized minorities in the political system? It would be a terrific webinar. We could engage lots of young people to watch.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. We are over time. I want to thank you, Dr. Hetty Fry, Dr. Karen Mock, and Andrew Griffith. Thank you very much for your time. More importantly, thank you for all the work you have done and continue to do in this field. It's an important one, and as we look at 50 years of multiculturalism, it's been really special to have you be part of this discussion today. I want to tell the audience that we're going to carry on this discussion at the Pearson Center under a theme of dialogue on diversity, and I should tell you that we started it in June with an interview with Michelle Best, who wrote a novel called 5 Little Indians. She's an incredible Indigenous author who's written a very timely book about 5 survivors. Well, it's a novel about 5 survivors of the residential school system. I urge you to go and look at that webinar on our YouTube channel and buy the book as well. Over the next few weeks, we've got a number of other sessions coming up on topics related to the issues we've talked about. We're going to have a discussion with Senator Don Oliver from Nova Scotia shortly. In November, we've got 3 webinars on racism, 2 of which will really focus on that issue of defining systemic racism that we talked about, which seems to be really confounding people as to what it is and how we deal with it. We'll have a number of other webinars dealing with economic recovery, and on the care agenda with addresses issues like seniors care and childcare. So please join us over the many webinars we've got ahead of us over the months ahead, and keep in touch. All of this information will be on our website and on our various social media platforms. Thank you for joining us. Again, special thank you to our panel.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks very much.
Wonderful.